Welcome to Overcoming Interdisciplinary Imposter Syndrome. My name is Rose Ernst. I'm a former associate professor and chair of political science and now an academic editor, consultant, and coach. Before we get started, I'd love for you to just take a moment to pause and to breathe. Take a deep breath in and out. And I'd like you to imagine a scholar who you admire. And this can be someone who you look up to as a role model, but they embody something that you would like for yourself. So some sort of identity, way of being. And imagine them and see if you can articulate what it is about them that you would like to emulate. And to take another deep breath and hold on to this idea and this person or this identity as we go through the rest of the presentation. So today we're dealing with imposter syndrome, which is a big topic. And I want to say from the outset that it's difficult to deal with imposter syndrome. And we're going to talk about some strategies today. But in addition to imposter syndrome, there are layers, you could say, of imposter syndrome. And one of them has to do with being an interdisciplinary scholar. And I think that being an interdisciplinary scholar does not mean you need to have imposter syndrome. So we're going to really try to peel back some of those layers after we talk about where imposter syndrome comes from, its interdisciplinary characteristics, and then how to overcome and embrace them. So I want to start with this quote from Michelle Obama about imposter syndrome. She was talking to a group of school children in the United Kingdom when she admitted to her own imposter syndrome. I still have a little bit of imposter syndrome. It doesn't go away. That feeling, you shouldn't take me that seriously. What do I know? I share that with you because we all have doubts in our abilities about our power and what that power is. So she's articulating imposter syndrome and that she has it, which should hopefully make you feel a little bit more at home. But also she's talking about power and what that power is. So we have doubts about our own power, how to use it, and in what context we might use it. And that's part, I think, of dealing with imposter syndrome is really coming to understand our own power and how we use it in different contexts. So a little bit of background about imposter phenomenon, as it was first called. So two psychologists first detailed this in an academic paper, a study of academic women much like themselves. And it's a fascinating paper that's worth reading in detail because they go through all the different aspects of it and what they found and how people cope with it. But they really coined the term. And so we're going to talk a little bit about their first definition of this and then get into a little more details. So despite outstanding academic and professional accomplishments, women who experience the imposter phenomenon persist in believing that they are really not bright and have fooled anyone who thinks otherwise. Numerous achievements, which one might expect to provide ample objective evidence of superior intellectual functioning, do not appear to affect the imposter belief. So the first part, as you can see, that is most commonly identified with imposter phenomenon or syndrome is that you believe that you're some sort of fraud and that people are going to discover you at some point. And the second really important point for all of you as academics, as high achievers, is that numerous achievements, which you would think would sort of mitigate some of this imposter syndrome, actually don't have an effect because your identity is one of an imposter. And if your identity is one of an imposter, you can throw as many achievements as you want on top of that, but it's not going to change that identity unless you're actually doing the internal work to change that identity yourself. So there are three types that are worth looking at, and hopefully you can identify which ones pop up most for you. The first one we just mentioned, which is fear of being discovered as a fraud or a fake. And this can be an incredibly intense fear. And at least for me, it's popped up just in very specific moments and in very specific contexts, not so much just as a general phenomenon. Number two, a belief that achievement comes from hard work or luck rather than skill or intelligence. So this can be deeply ingrained and can be socialization from childhood as well, where you're taught that other people are brilliant or smart in some sort of innate way, and you're telling yourself a story that you've gotten to where you are as a result of your effort and your hard work and discipline rather than some, innate qualities that you have. And when I mean innate, I don't necessarily mean that, you were born with them. I just mean that's the way that we talk about it, right? And then number three, the inability to acknowledge recognition for achievement. So this is almost more of a symptom in some ways, where you're just unable to recognize the achievement and be thankful for it on the outside. But this is also internally what we just talked about, which is that, no matter how many achievements you have a really hard time internalizing that as meaning something about you as a non-imposter, as someone who's supposed to be a scholar, right? Okay. So there are three sources, and there are probably many more sources, but these are three big sources of imposter syndrome. The first is early praise for being smart. So this is somewhat counterintuitive. But what's going on here is that if you were told you were smart as a child, and again, you are essentially being rewarded in some way for being smart, whatever that means, then when you do something that is counter to being smart, let's say you don't do well on a test, it's not that you just didn't do well on a test and that was, let's say, a mistake, right? What it becomes is a judgment of your own character and your identity. So it negates the fact that you are smart. And therefore, it's really a central attack on your core being, which is unfortunate because if you think about it, the reverse is not necessarily true. So your achievements essentially are just maintaining your identity in some ways, being smart, but they're not actually adding to your idea that you are not an imposter, right? But this early sort of praise can have a counterintuitive effect and be quite damaging because, again, if you make a mistake, then you feel like you are a mistake. Number two, one that we're all very familiar with, institutional and individual oppression. And this is very insidious because it is reinforced on an external level in addition, right, to whatever's going on for you internally. And then those two together are kind of a very difficult combination to disentangle, right? So if you're receiving cues or outright messages from people around you and from institutions that you do not belong, right, due to your race, gender, sexuality, etc., then, and you already have that belief because of socialization, then those two things are just going to play off each other and make you feel like even more of an imposter. So environment can help, right? So if you have an environment that's not doing this, or doing it less, we should say, then that can help. But if you still have that individual internalization, then that's going to make it very difficult still to move forward. And then number three, paradox of meritocracy. So I personally do not believe in a meritocracy, nor do I want a meritocracy. However, I have to recognize the fact that as an academic, I have essentially jumped through a series of meritocratic hoops to get to where I am, right? So we're told from a very early age that we're doing well on tests, that we have good grades, etc., etc. And so we're meeting all the quote unquote objective standards of meritocracy to get where we are. And then when something goes wrong again, then we feel like we don't merit where we're at. So if we get a little bit of a lower, teacher evaluation, or we get a small critique, right, of some sort on our journal article, then again, that can reinforce imposter syndrome because we feel that we're receiving quote unquote objective measures that tell us that we don't belong. So when we receive those measures, it reinforces actually the idea of meritocracy because we feel that we don't belong. And then if that plays into number two, you can see the real insidious relationship between number two and number three, right? In institutional forms. So all of these three things can contribute to generalized imposter phenomenon or syndrome. And here is something I wanted to note before we move on to the interdisciplinary characteristics that is very interesting. And that is that actually psychologists have found that imposter syndrome exists across the population. However, it affects different groups of people differently, depending on where they're positioned in the power hierarchy. So they say women tend to be far more uncomfortable, and again, I don't know, they just are using the terms men and women, they're not including non-binary folks. Women tend to be far more uncomfortable in its grip because they believe their inner and outer world should make a perfect match. Men are more likely to accept that bravado or a brave front is one of the things expected of them. Okay, so it took me a while to kind of figure out what is going on here, and let me see if I give you an example, I'm hoping that this will help. So just as a personal example, in graduate school, when my colleagues who were white, cis, middle to upper class men would go into the classroom as teaching assistants, they could roll into the classroom as a teaching assistant without having prepped and do just fine. In other words, students wouldn't challenge their authority, class would go well, even if they really didn't have an idea of what they were talking about. And then for myself and for other colleagues, including people of color and women, we tended to, I would say, probably over-prepare, but at least we prepared. We were very serious about preparing. And we would go in, and things would generally go okay, more or less, but we would spend a lot of time on preparing. Now, that doesn't tell us much about women other than, and possibly people of color in terms of where we are in the power hierarchy and that we feel the need to really prepare because we've had previous experience of students challenging our authority based on our identities. But what's more interesting here is what's going on with the men. So what's going on is they are going into a situation knowing that they are unprepared. And in that case, you could say they're a kind of imposter, right? Because they haven't actually done any of the work to prepare, and they may be just actually presenting as if they know more than they actually do, right? So they may, deflect a question or just not answer something. And so what they're getting is a repetition of experiences where they enter into a situation and they haven't prepared, and so they may feel essentially like an imposter, but no one is challenging their authority and making them feel like an imposter. So there's a mismatch there. And so they're used to, in some ways, having there be a mismatch between the inner and outer expectations, whereas women believe that our inner and outer world should make a perfect match. And that would explain why we would over-prepare. All right, so that's just an interesting aside for sociologists. And now I want to move into the 4 characteristics of interdisciplinary imposter syndrome. And here, when I'm talking about being an interdisciplinary scholar, I don't just mean someone who is housed, for example, in women and gender studies or international studies or Africana studies in an explicitly interdisciplinary program. I'm talking about people who can be housed in one discipline but actually use interdisciplinary methods, or maybe they teach interdisciplinary courses and so forth, right? So I'm talking about probably actually the majority of scholars have some interdisciplinary aspect to their scholarship. And this is particularly true if you teach like at a liberal arts school where this is often encouraged and sort of a necessity. So this is not, again, just people who are in interdisciplinary programs. Okay, so the first sort of symptom of this, if you will, is frozen deer syndrome, as I call it. So there are a couple of aspects where this can pop up. So you feel completely overwhelmed by your methodological options. Let's say you have a general research question, you haven't narrowed it down, and you're wondering, well, how should I go about researching this? And you have all these options because you have multiple disciplines to draw on. The challenge is there's too many options, and you may have had a hodgepodge of methods and theoretical training in graduate school, right? So what this can produce is sort of a lack of confidence in all of your methods because you haven't actually been thoroughly trained in like one specific or two specific types of methodology. This doesn't actually mean that you're not adept at using them or you can't learn how to use them. It's just I'm talking about kind of the messages you received in terms of your training. So you may just be overwhelmed, and then you may not feel confident enough in the methods that you chose in order to move forward, and therefore you spin your wheels. A related problem is you cannot choose a publication. You have too many options in front of you because you have many more than a disciplinary scholar. The article doesn't fit into a disciplinary journal. And then another challenge is interdisciplinary journals often have a lower ranking, which has nothing to do with their quality. It just has to do with whether or not they are receiving institutional support of some sort. And then you often, when you do actually decide where you're going to submit your journal, submit your article to your journal, you often receive confusing feedback from disciplinary reviewers. Now, this can happen to anyone. We can receive very confusing feedback from anyone in terms of a review. But what adds to the problem is this sense of, let's say that you had the problem of your methods training, and then you get feedback from a disciplinary scholar saying you're not using this method right, or you should use this method. You're already feeling insecure about the methods you chose, and so you may end up overcompensating and worrying too much and making too many changes to your method, or just throwing up your hands and thinking, well, I didn't choose the right method to begin with, therefore this research isn't worth it, and so I'm just going to let that sit on my desktop in a folder and gather dust, right? And then you don't actually ever publish it, which is the worst case scenario and hopefully won't happen to you. That's kind of an extreme scenario, but you can see how it can create a lot of confusion and anxiety that can make it even harder to just even start the scholarship process of continuing to publish. Number 3, you feel like a double or a triple fraud. So again, if you have imposter syndrome and then you have these different disciplinary areas, then your disciplinary insecurities are going to multiply, especially if you feel like you weren't trained in one or the other, and you feel like somehow, being trained has essentially in two disciplines has spread your training in a thin way, right? So you feel like, oh, I only have a superficial understanding, for example, of history and sociology because I wasn't trained just in sociology. Well, that's a myth. We can get into that later. But that's a way that you could definitely feel, right? Because you feel like you haven't gone in depth enough. You feel like you don't belong anywhere, including potentially the interdisciplinary niche, if there is one that's actually a program. The feedback that you receive from other interdisciplinary scholars is often scattered. And this is not so much because interdisciplinary scholars are scattered at all, but because you're probably all coming from different perspectives. And this can be obviously a bonus, but it also can contribute to the feeling that you don't belong or that there's something wrong with your particular research area. And then I've experienced this myself and watched others experience this. You're just flat out dismissed by disciplinary scholars. And this often happens internally to a department where they just say, I don't understand what it is that you do. They say that. And, that can be very difficult to recover from, but you just have to realize that that's feedback that you're receiving from them about themselves and their own issues, not about you. They just don't know what to do with you, and so they express this kind of frustration. Number 4, you don't know who has your back. So, as an interdisciplinary scholar, you're often split between at least two different departments, and therefore, well-intentioned mentorship can go wrong. And what I mean by this is that you could have, let's say, a wonderful chair in one department who's mentoring you, and they're giving you advice that really goes against the grain in the other department, right? Or it's just not really very appropriate for you because you're split between two departments. Maybe they're saying you need to spend more time in our department when actually you really don't. You need to spend more time in the other department, or, some other aspect of the university, right? And then finally, you just don't know where to ask for accurate advice. This is a general problem, but it's really multiplied when you are an interdisciplinary scholar. So let's talk about 10 ways to deal with this. And before we do that, I want to circle back to what we talked about at the very beginning with the breathe slide. And I think that, if you think about our lives as scholars, right, our lives as scholars or as I should say, as academics, are split into three different parts, even though there are even more. And that is teaching, scholarship, and service, right? And I think that we have a very strong sense of who we are as teachers that we develop early on. And this is because we observe others, we've been taught ourselves, and we receive constant feedback, even if we don't necessarily want it all the time, about our teaching, right? So if I were to ask you, who are you as a teacher? You could come up with some words, caring, responsible, provocative, analytical, creative, right, et cetera, et cetera. And this could be even true for your identity in terms of service, although that kind of, develops over time. But as a scholar, oftentimes I find that people I coach and my colleagues don't really have a strong identity as a scholar. They have a strong identity in terms of what they research, like their area of research, but they don't really have a strong identity of who they are as a scholar, right? Like you do as a teacher. And this is really important because not only obviously is it important for you to know who you are just in general, but if you want to change any of your habits around being a scholar, such as writing, like do you want to write more often? Do you want to be a little bolder about what you write and where you publish? Those things only change if you change your identity. And here I'm speaking to a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, some of you may be familiar with. But the basic idea is that unless you change your identity, your habits are not necessarily going to change. And they can change temporarily, but they're always going to fall back if you don't actually embrace your identity that is related to that particular habit, right? Okay. So let me give you some words for you to think about. Are you flexible, creative, courageous, playful, inquisitive, devoted, accountable, self-integral, revolutionary, generous? These are all just possibilities just to get you thinking about what are the words that I would use to describe myself as a scholar. And then once you have those words, you can always refer back to them and say, well, how am I operating in that way? And then what this allows us to do is stop being pushed and pulled and reacting to everyone else's idea of what a scholar is. And that will make you a lot less insecure, right? Because especially as an interdisciplinary scholar, you need to have a very strong sense of yourself so that when the criticisms, inevitable judgments come along, you can essentially dismiss them because you're not really concerned because you know who you are, right? And so if someone criticizes you for not being creative enough, but that's not part of your identity, well, then that's not really that important to you, right? That you receive that criticism because you know who you are. All right, so let's move on to the different ways to deal with interdisciplinary imposter syndrome. So I'm going to take a little water break. Okay, number one, I want you to embrace your special snowflake status. And special snowflake is often used in a pejorative way, but I think here you need to just embrace this because you are very special, right? And I mean that in the sense of you have a very unique identity and you have a very unique research area and very unique way of approaching scholarship. So what that means is that you really need to craft different elevator pitches for different audiences. And here what I mean are short, essential, short statements about what it is that you do for different disciplines that are related to your area, right? So if you are a philosopher who is in women and gender studies and religious studies, let's say, you need to craft elevator pitches that are written and then verbal ones for each of those three audiences. So that when you interact with these different audiences who are absolutely essential to your career and things such as, your review and tenure, that they understand how you relate to their discipline. And if you don't do this, you're going to end up with the same problem we talked about before, which is that they just dismissed you because they can't understand who you are. And it's not fair that you have to do this because disciplinary scholars have to essentially do one elevator pitch. But it's essential that you do this right up front from the beginning of your career. And to some degree, you have to do this when you're on the job market. But then I think what happens is once you get the job, then you have a whole different group of people that you're dealing with now. And you really need to refine kind of that message. And you probably have to do that throughout your career. So the second part of this is be selective when soliciting and taking feedback from disciplinary scholars. So if you ask for feedback from a disciplinary scholar, you are going to need to be prepared to react and act on that. And so maybe you just don't want to ask for it. Just so, just keeping that in mind as a political measure is important. But also then when you receive that feedback, say in written form as in the form of a journal review, just be selective about that and think about, okay, well, I really thoroughly understand what I'm contributing to philosophy, for example, because I've done that elevator pitch. Now I can tell what is useful in this review and what is not useful in this review, right? And at some point you may decide you're going to push back on it, or you just decide, you know what, I'm going to submit this to some other journal that really can understand what it is that I'm doing. You also really want to avoid comparisonitis. This is particularly true, I think, for scholars who are they're further along as graduate students. So, almost to their PhD, postdocs, and then early career assistant professors. This is really important because what happens, I've noticed, is that disciplinary scholars early on tend to receive a lot of rewards and goodies. And that actually can peter out pretty quickly. They can achieve star status, and then that can just kind of go downhill, like very flash in the pan kind of thing. Whereas interdisciplinary scholars don't generally receive, I would say, as much support in the beginning. But as their career builds, they actually gain more momentum because their contribution becomes more clear, I think. And so it's really important that you avoid that comparisonitis in the beginning because you will start to feel lost, especially if you're doing things just fine, but your colleagues seem to be getting more rewards, if you will. And then the last part is take time to find your people. This is really difficult to do and takes a long time for a lot of interdisciplinary scholars, although some people get lucky right off the bat, like they go to a particular symposium that's really in their research area and they find a group of scholars who understand exactly what they do and they're wonderful to work with, which is an important aspect of this. So once you find this group of people, you want to keep going to, let's say they have an annual conference or a symposium every year, you want to keep interacting with those people. This is super important for you because you don't have many people to draw on from for feedback who can really understand what it is you're doing, and then also who can be your supporters and cheerleaders For example, people who are a little bit farther along than you, they might write an external letter for you, right, at some point for your tenure process. So you really want to cultivate this group of people over your career and just keep looking for them. If you can't find them and you just don't feel like it's fitting yet, well, just keep looking and you'll eventually find them. Number two, you have triple the journal options. So instead of looking at this as I'm overwhelmed, recognize that you actually have a lot of options, and actually there's some surprising benefits to having all these options. So first of all, you need to educate your disciplines and your committees about your field, which is what we just were talking about with the elevator pitches, right? But this is particularly true in terms of your journals, right? So you need to tell them what this journal is about. You can't just put the title and expect them to understand it, especially if they're in a particular discipline. Now, the issue around impact factor is an interesting one. If you explain to your, let's say, rank and tenure committee or your department or your dean that your journals don't have impact factor because they're interdisciplinary journals and therefore they haven't been around that long, or they're actually not indexed in a particular way, right, for impact factor. If you explain that up front and are clear about it, then it gives you the opportunity to actually explain in a qualitative way how these journals are important, which you actually don't get if you are relying solely on quantitative impact factor, right? So this is actually an opportunity and you can use it to your benefit. And again, this is kind of surprising, but I definitely have seen this work in the rank and tenure process. And then finally, you also have a higher chance of acceptance precisely because there are fewer people competing for a spot in the journal, right? And then if you pick the right journal in your interdisciplinary scholar, it's so perfect that they're really going to want to work with you to make sure that they publish that article. All right, you also have triple the options for funding. So you have 2 home disciplines plus an interdisciplinary niche that you should be looking for in terms of funding. You also, some people forget that they cross major fields. So for example, humanities and social science, maybe you're actually located somewhere in between the two, or there's a crossover, or you're in business and humanities, for example, right? So look for unknown, sort of unexpected places. So if I'm a social scientist, I'm used to looking for social science fellowships, but I actually do a lot that crosses over to the humanities, so I should look at humanities fellowships and not just dismiss them because I'm not completely, like, I don't think of myself as a humanities scholar. So here are some possibilities: HNet, Vanderbilt database, and I've just come recently across the Duke Research database, which has really great fellowships broken down by different disciplines and interdisciplinary areas as well. Number 4, you're a liberated teacher. I think sometimes we tend to forget that while being an interdisciplinary scholar sometimes means you have to do more work in terms of teaching because sometimes you have more courses to teach, experimentation is a necessity. And that means that you're actually really freed up as a teacher to try out different kinds of things precisely because students don't know what to expect from you. If they're signing up for a course and they're coming from philosophy and education, specifically into your interdisciplinary course, they don't necessarily have any background and expectations that they might bring with them if it were a disciplinary bound course that's sometimes actually difficult to deal with. And so they're a little bit more open, and oftentimes they're more excited actually about the topic because it's so specific to what they're interested in. And then finally, I would say you definitely have the opportunity to use it more for your research. A lot of disciplinary scholars end up teaching what we might call service courses, so like introduction courses over and over and over again, whereas interdisciplinary scholars sometimes have more opportunities to do things in a more flexible way with courses that are more tailored, that can be tailored actually to their research. So use that as an opportunity to get momentum on your research. Number 5, you have more relationship building opportunities. both on campus and off campus, in and with communities. And this is because it's just a natural sort of thing to happen, right? You're in these different fields and you're trying to communicate with different people, so you're often invited to really interesting events on campus to speak. And then you often have to communicate to multiple audiences, so you're used to actually eliminating some of the jargon that is difficult for general audiences to understand, much less, it's hard for a different discipline to understand. So you're used to these different dances with communication, so you should really recognize that, use that to your benefit, not only in terms of the way you present yourself as a scholar for various audiences, but also use it in terms of translating your research for the public. Okay, now we're getting into some politics here because I'm a political scientist and I'm interested in this. So use the chaos to your advantage. All right, so don't make excuses for yourself just because administrators don't know what to do with you. So this is what happens, right? Interdisciplinary research is often upheld as a very interesting, sort of almost sexy topic in universities, but it doesn't actually get a lot of real support. And what I mean by that is university is still divided into silos. And so administrators, particularly, deans, have difficulty understanding where you fit. And that's not your fault. It's actually not their fault. We just don't know what to do with you is basically what's going on. Now, that can translate into severe imposter syndrome, but you shouldn't have to make an excuse for what you do. You just need to make your case, right? So in addition to knowing how to speak to these different audiences, you have the opportunity to call on scholars in other departments to broaden your reach and to protect yourself. So if you just stay in your one, discipline, in your one department, even though you're an interdisciplinary scholar, you're missing out on opportunities to actually have allies who can support you, who may be farther along in their career in other departments, right? In committee situations and so forth. And they're also great oftentimes for advice. So that's something that you definitely don't want. You don't want this kind of chaos to kind of consume you in a structural way. Similarly, you actually have the opportunity to avoid some departmental issues. Sometimes some departments are split along methodological lines. And so as an interdisciplinary scholar, you can just gracefully say, I actually don't have a horse in this race, so I'm staying out of it, right? And you can, when other colleagues try to draw you into the drama, it's relatively easy to just sort of draw that boundary, and it doesn't have to be personal. It's just like, this is actually, I don't belong necessarily in either of these camps. And then number two, if things get really desperate, and hopefully this will never happen to you, but it is a possibility, if things are bad in one department and you're an interdisciplinary scholar, you're actually uniquely positioned to move to another department, which is great sometimes because there are situations where a department is so difficult that scholars feel they actually need to leave that university and go to another university. And so this can be kind of middle ground, which is that maybe there's just really some dysfunctional dynamics in your department, but there's another department that's relatively friendly and serene. Then you can actually move to that department, assuming, of course, that it is related to your interdisciplinary scholarship. All right, number 8, respond holistically to reviewer critique. So while it's easy to get caught up in the drama of a disciplinary scholar's critique being, very difficult to take, it's actually easier for you to spot whether or not this is a disciplinary pet peeve of a reviewer. And, we all have our various pet peeves around methods or ways that articles are written or punctuation or whatever it is. But it's a lot easier when you're an interdisciplinary scholar to see that this is something that is very unique and particular to this individual, rather than it being a bigger issue you really need to worry about with your scholarship. Similarly, you can see the big picture of reviewer feedback because let's say, you've submitted this to an interdisciplinary journal and you receive feedback from a historian and a political scientist. You're going to see some pretty big differences potentially between the two of them. And so that allows you to take a much more global view of the feedback and see if there are essentially themes rather than particularities between the two reviewers. And then if you do see some overlap, well, then that may be something you do need to address. Then number 3, move on to another journal if they don't understand your approach. Don't get stuck. So again, if they're just trashing your methodology, or just trashing you in general, it's time to move on to another journal. Don't let that stop you from getting your research out there. I've seen this happen time and time again. Scholars get stuck with nasty feedback, and then they don't move that piece to another journal because they think there's something wrong with it. Usually there isn't something wrong with it. Many of us have submitted articles. I'm trying to think in my own case, I think I've submitted a journal article, one particular one, I think to 5 different journals before we finally got it accepted. And then we just got it accepted because it clicked. They finally understood. And if we had let any of that we received a lot of nasty feedback. If we had let any of that get to us, this was a co-authored piece, we wouldn't have ever published it, right? And we wouldn't have found the right journal. So don't let that happen to you. Number 9, interdisciplinary scholars, I'm going to be bold and say this, they produce more innovative research. And if you look at, any of the major contributions of academics research over time to society, you can see that it usually comes from interdisciplinary scholarship, or at least the joining of some ideas between disciplines together. So you need to just accept and embrace that you're probably ahead of your time. And once you, I think, accept this, then it becomes a little bit easier because then you're building towards something and you know that you have something valuable to contribute and people will eventually catch on. So I just put 2 quick examples here of things that I thought of in different areas. One is, This Bridge Called My Back, Radical Queer Women of Color anthology from 1981 that if you look at it, it was incredibly, cutting edge at the time and still remains that way, I would say, today. And that is very much an interdisciplinary effort. Another example is Samir Musa from 1917, who combined nuclear physics and medicine in pursuit of cancer treatment. And there are endless examples here, but I think this is just something that, if you embrace this and accept it, then it should make things a lot easier for you. Related to that, finally, is that your research can be more sustainable, and I mean more sustainable over the course of a career. So advantages of shiny object syndrome mean, shiny object syndrome is essentially kind of like a magpie moving from one shiny object to another. And this is often seen as a negative thing. But for an interdisciplinary scholar, we're multi-potentialites. We have many, many different interests. And being interdisciplinary gives us the flexibility actually to pick and choose and move relatively easily and nimbly between different subjects and different types of research, which can make it much more exciting and interesting, right? Because we can join together ideas that would not normally be joined together and move on to different things relatively easily. So just recognize you're an omnivore in a carnivore and herbivore's world, right? You're trying all kinds of different things. And if you're the kind of person like a multi-potentialite, which means that you have all kinds of different interests, right? You can really thrive over the course of a career. So again, in addition to understanding that you're probably ahead of your time, you have the nimbleness and flexibility to be able to move to different types of research questions, whereas disciplinary scholars, sometimes they get stuck, not only in terms of their research area, but they just don't actually even realize that there's a way that they can move into something else. And so they can easily become burnout from that too. So again, your career potentially is a lot more sustainable. And finally, just embrace your weird. Free yourself from stale, outdated, oppressive identities of who scholars are supposed to be, right? And again, this is why I think it's so important that you identify for yourself who you are as a scholar, because there are a lot of weird things that are thrown at us in weird and not necessarily a helpful way about who and what scholars should be, such as, you need to produce X number of articles every year no matter what. And of course, if you're on the tenure track, that's just a reality. But afterwards, you need to rethink, do I want to produce quantity over quality, right? If you think of that distinction that way. And then, you just need to embrace this particular identity. It's going to change over time, but if you are conscious of it, I think it can really be helpful instead of reacting to other people's ideas about you or about what scholarship should be. So again, I put these up here for you to think about the different words that you might associate. And then finally, in closing, I wanted to put up these two quotes as a way to close out and recognize the freedom you have as an interdisciplinary scholar, and that oftentimes the fear is there just before you jump into playing big. All right, we're going to move on to Q&A. Thank you very much.